Okay. Let's try this again.
Welcome to Forking Off, the podcast by former feds who got the fork out. I'm Jill Fields.
And I'm Philip Fields.
Now, before we get started, make sure to hit the follow button.
You can find all our content and show notes on our website, forkingoff.com.
And if you enjoy what we do and want to help, consider supporting us on Ko-fi.
This season, we're going to be doing things a little differently.
We're still going to be interviewing former feds and sharing their stories, but we're going to focus more on how they're continuing to serve and what we can learn from their expertise. All right. So today's episode, we're going to be interviewing Dan Tully. Dan is running for the U.S. House of Representatives for a seat in Illinois. We're going to talk to Dan in a few minutes, but before we get started, there's been a lot of talk, Philip. We've talked a lot about voter fraud conspiracies. What's going on there?
Yeah, I keep getting people asking about stolen elections. People are still asking about 2020, but now for some reason people are asking about whether 2024 was stolen by Trump.
Oh, so what are these different ones? There's a claim that there were more votes than registered voters in some districts. Where was that? That was like Pennsylvania or something? No, that was Wisconsin.
Yeah, that was in Wisconsin. I think a lot of it came from Milwaukee County. There were these 4 wards in Oak Creek. They had 100% of registered voters plus a few cast ballots. And so people were like, what? That's weird. But what you need to know about Wisconsin is you can actually register to vote the day of. Like you can show up at the polling place and register and cast your vote.
That's awesome.
And so these were pretty small voter districts. They had like 1,800-ish people registered to vote. So in one, there were like 1,006 registered voters. 1,019 ballots were cast. So it's not hard to believe that like maybe not all of the actual registered voters voted, but maybe 100 people showed up and registered and cast their ballots. And that pushed them less than 20 over what
the actual registered voters
of what the actual, and it's that same way across these 4 different wards in Milwaukee County. The actual number is usually within about 25 of what the registered voters were. That's not weird. Once you understand that, like it makes sense. People were really motivated to get out and vote that election. And so people who hadn't voted in the past showed up and said, hey, I want to do this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hey, that's great. Great to know that some places you can register to vote the day of. Okay, well, what about there were some claims that there were more registered voters than voting age people in the state?
So that was Wisconsin again. And they do this interesting thing in Wisconsin where they never purge names from the voter rolls. Even if you move out of state, even if you die, they just mark you inactive. And so that actually helps them to track when somebody is no longer allowed to vote. Because if somebody shows up and says, hey, I want to vote as so-and-so, they can look right there and say, you're supposed to be dead, right?
Well, I mean, that's a good thing to be able to say, no.
And so in Wisconsin, the voter roll number keeps growing. It's at like 8.3 million as of July 2025. But the voting age population is 4.6 million. But the active voter list is 3.7 million. And so all of those extra numbers are just people who they're keeping on the list so that they can make sure these people aren't trying to vote without re-registering.
Okay, so that explains that one. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to ask you about is there's this group, Election Truth Alliance. They've put out some statistics about statistical improbabilities. I saw it last summer and asked you about it, and
yeah, this one keeps coming up. I remember the first time, I think you mentioned it first, and I just kind of blew it off because I was like, this is ridiculous.
And I was like, well, okay, if there's something to this, we will see more data start cropping up and we'll be able to see if there was.
And then we didn't, but I kept hearing about it from other people. So I was like, okay, I need to look closer at this. It's this group, the Election Truth Alliance, and they've been presenting statistical arguments that suggest there was fraud in the 2024 election. And essentially they're saying Trump couldn't have won the 7 swing states on the margins that he did. And they're basing it on these academic models that were developed by this professor at the University of Michigan, Dr. Walter Mabane. And so he's developed these models to identify anomalies in elections, and they get labeled as fraud. But even he recognizes there are some fundamental ambiguities and an inability to observe voter intent. So he recognizes, though, these two types of fraud. There's procedural fraud and realized fraud. And for procedural fraud, he gives examples like assassination attempts, long lines at the polls, things that interrupt the flow of voting.
Okay, so basically people just kind of not influencing, but...
Well, and so it can be because the system is inefficient, or it could be intentional. But he recognizes it's not really possible to tell the difference from the metrics that his models collect. And so he doesn't address procedural fraud. He says there's no way of knowing if it actually changes the actual vote count. And so he focuses on realized fraud. This results from what he calls malevolent distortion. It's the misdirection or misallocation of votes compared to voter intent. But if you remember, he says you can't actually observe voter intent. So there's a lot of ambiguity even in this metric. Then there's this thing that he calls strategic behavior. When voters change their behavior based on expectation of others or the actions of campaigns or officials, and it changes voting patterns. And this can happen for a broad range of reasons. And it intersects a lot with procedural fraud and ends up looking like realized fraud. This is stuff like the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. That was a catalyzing event for Trump's base. It also looks like the bomb threats that happened in Philadelphia at some of the polling places that delayed people's ability to vote. That's like a malevolent type of indicator, but you still can't actually measure who decided not to go back and who did, right? It's a really tricky one. But then there's also stuff like Kamala's late entry in the race.
Yeah.
That changed voter behavior. People who might have been more or less inclined to vote for Biden, now Kamala's there, that changes their calculus. But
It's a very different candidate.
Right.
Yeah.
But then on top of that, there were some issues that came up at the last minute in the race that impacted how some of her voters had probably intended to vote. All of these things add up. That is what creates this strategic behavior that this model also can't account for. And it's super prevalent in highly polarized two-party systems like the United States. So in these systems, strategy looks a lot like fraud. And that's why this model can't confidently say that there was fraud in the election. But then even the Election Truth Alliance acknowledged that they went back and they did hand counts in a lot of these precincts. And the hand counts match the machine counts. And so their argument is, well, we need to make sure that we're doing hand counts to defend the election against this type of fraud. That doesn't actually address a lot of the potential influence over the elections that might occur, right? Doing hand counts isn't going to tell you that people didn't come to vote because they were afraid ICE was going to be there.
Okay.
It doesn't really address information campaigns that are designed to increase partisan divides. And so they make all of these really wild arguments based on statistics, but then they give this recommendation that has no impact on election security. It's just not productive.
We're going to be coming up on midterms. Our guest, Dan Tully, we will be talking with him more about the elections and his thoughts on it. Since the 2024 elections, and especially like in March of last year, when Trump put out an executive order of preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections and wanting to federalize or nationalize the elections, the federal government does not run the elections. That's state governments. It is Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution, and it says the states are going to run the election. It has been very broadly interpreted to all federal elections. So federal government's role. Congress can make a law, make or alter laws and regulations on elections. That's it. There is no independent role for the president in conducting elections. None.
No.
None. It does not vest with the executive power. There is no inherent power of the president to do this. No. No.
No.
But as far as midterms go, Trump is very concerned that the Republicans will lose the House and the Senate, and he has already said he knows he'll be impeached if that happens. So that is something to keep an eye on.
There have been some claims that they were going to have organizations like ICE at the polling places.
Yes.
But there is an actual federal law that prevents law enforcement from being within a certain distance of a polling place while elections are ongoing.
Yeah, you can't go in your official capacity. You can go and vote if you are a federal employee, but you cannot go secure the polling place.
Yeah, that would be very illegal. We're also starting to see a lot of people rehashing old conspiracy theories. We can include some links in the show notes to everybody who's already debunked these.
While we talk with Dan, he's going to highlight some indicators also to watch.
So what can we do though, Jill?
What can we do? Well, first of all, educate yourself. Educate yourself about your candidates. Educate yourself about voting in your area. How is voting set up? Where's your polling place? Are you registered?
And if you live in a place where there are local issues being considered, like here in California, we have propositions, know what those are, know what the impacts are.
Also, get involved in your community. You can join civic groups. You can participate in voter registration drives. You can check your registration status with your state. Vote.org is a great place to look if you're not sure where to look. And make use of early voting. I know in California, you can get a text saying, hey, we've received your ballot.
I would actually say early voting is a big one for anybody who is worried about if ICE tries to show up at polling places and things like that. If you show up at a polling place and you get detained, that's your vote. But that's a good reason to take advantage of early voting or vote by mail and doing it far enough in advance that you can make sure that you'll be safe however you're doing that.
Now, if you're voting by mail, something that you need to be aware of is don't wait till the last minute. There have been some changes with the U.S. Postal Service, with their processes that could possibly delay your voter registration, your ballot application. The postmarks may be later than you're expecting.
And most importantly, actually vote.
Vote.
Yep.
That is how you participate in our democracy and in our government.
All right, let's roll the interview.
Okay. Hi, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you both for having me. Really excited to talk with you.
Yeah, we're so excited to hear about everything that you're up to lately. But why don't we go ahead and get started with your bluff, your bottom line up front?
Absolutely. I am a former federal civil servant. I used to work for the U.S. Department of Commerce and in the foreign assistance and diplomacy space specifically. I left the federal government in March in protest of what this administration was doing to the foreign assistance space and to the civil service at large. And now I am running for Congress in an open congressional seat here in Chicagoland to restore the rule of law. And really excited to speak with you further about not only the civil servant background, but also the steps that we could take in our government right now to push back against not only this administration, but also to stand up for our government and reshape the conditions for future success in our democracy.
I'm so excited, and so excited that somebody that's a former civil servant is running for office. That's something we had talked with one of our previous guests, Patty Hartman, who had worked for DOJ, and she was like, I encourage everyone. So we were so excited to have you here, and you're doing this. So tell us a little bit more about your background and how you ended up in public service to begin with.
Sounds great. I graduated law school back in 2017, and I decided to take two paths simultaneously. One, I went to a big law firm as I had $200,000 of student loan debt to pay off. But at the same time, I went to the Army Reserve JAG Corps, ended up serving about 3.5 years on active duty over the course of a 7-year period. I served at an agency that was transferring acquisition power away from focus on counterinsurgency to large-scale combat operations. I also deployed for a year to the Middle East, mostly in Iraq, but also in Kuwait, advising a joint task force on countering ISIS, and then served for a year at Fort Bragg with a couple different units. And then most recently, I was at U.S. Indo-Pacific, where I was advising the 4-star commander and the legal team there on how to support a strategic partner in the region. I was doing that work in part because I had a LLM in Chinese law from Tsinghua University, and I was able to use some of that legal and some of the language background to be useful in that problem set. But that experience of countering Chinese influence through the military angle took me to the US Department of Commerce, where I was able to still engage in counter-China efforts, but this time from a foreign assistance angle. And I was traveling to different countries throughout the Asia Pacific, including Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Bangladesh, places that were looking to improve their legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks with US assistance and also connection to different international institutions. And that work was going really, really well up until the week of the inauguration, when I got a call to say, stop everything, cancel your programs, and come back to DC.
So you were overseas when the inauguration happened.
Yes, I was out with USAID working together on building a program for one of the Pacific Island countries. I got the call saying stop everything. I had to email every single partner that I had been working with overseas, saying that we have to take a pause. We don't know when it's coming back. And what really hit hard was I had to stop a program that I had been building for Ukraine, specifically the Ministry of Reconstruction. There was an anti-corruption program that we'd been expected to launch the very next month in February. And the folks in Ukraine wrote back, "We're really sorry to hear that. We're thinking of you." Them expressing their sympathies about what the U.S. was going through. And of course, later that day, they were struck by Russia's aggression. It was just another missile attack. So to think that we had partners and partnerships that we've been building across the world that were not only good for the U.S. economic interest, but also good for our security interest. We had partnerships and relationships with countries all throughout the Asia Pacific. That was the source of our strength. That was the source of our defense. And now this president, he sees our strength as having spheres of influence, as China having Asia, Russia having Europe, and the U.S. having the whole Western hemisphere. To turn our backs not only on our partners, but also our closest allies, I think is the most dangerous thing he's done.
Yeah.
Trump had always said America first foreign policy was his goal, but it's become increasingly apparent to me that it's not America first. It's simply Trump first. And Trump first foreign policy will, I think, lead to America alone. So that's one of the key things that I'm trying to fight back against right now.
I reread one of the old speeches from him just the other day, and he had made this big statement about how America was going to be more respected by its foreign partners because he was now in office. That is just such a patent lie at this point. That was never the intent.
It seems as though his intent at this point is simply for self-enrichment. There was a New York Times article 2 weeks ago about how in the first year of his term, he has already somehow raised at least $1.4 billion through his different schemes. Number one of which, of course, is his cryptocurrency for his family, that if a foreign country wants favorable exceptions to tariffs, all they have to do is make a deposit. It has evolved from his first term where he needed a hotel down the street. Now he doesn't need a hotel. He just has a crypto coin that the UAE can put $2 billion in for favorable exceptions to the tariffs that he hit them with. In fact, it seems as though his whole tariff approach, it's really a grift, saying these are the penalties that will be on trade with you. And if you want them removed, you know what to do. So that's another piece of one of my key policy proposals is I want to force any executive leader of any of a certain level of seniority to divest not only from being able to sell stocks and personal trades, but also to divest from and have their family divest from any crypto-based asset.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me as someone who was in the national security space. And every year, based on your clearances, you have to fill out these financial disclosures. And it's huge concern when you're doing this because they're concerned as to how it looks. And yet other people don't seem to feel that way.
And that's the thing about government ethics. There's such a sharp contrast in between the vast majority of government employees across all the branches, and then the folks at the very top. And the executive, we all have been through ethics briefs. I used to be an ethics counselor, and I know firsthand that so many people, the vast majority, do their best to comply. And yet, as we've just been discussing, the folks at the very top seem to have a pass. But it's not just the executive branch, it's the judicial as well. Almost every single federal judge and every single federal judiciary staff member, they're all subject to an ethics code, a pretty robust ethics code with strict penalties, except for the 9 folks at the very top. They get a pass because they are the justices and they sit above everyone. But I think that Congress should make sure that we pass legislation that requires those justices to be held to the same standard. And yet, of course, Congress is very much at fault as well. Every single staff member in Congress has to monitor their trading and has to comply with strict ethical guidelines. But the members themselves have access to the most sensitive information, not just for companies, but industry-wide information, and yet can trade at will. And this is not a Republican issue. This is both a Democrat and Republican issue, with progressive leaders, in fact, leading the charts with number of trades and total volume of trade value. So all that to say, I think that we need a concerted effort in our government to make sure that the rules that apply to the vast majority of employees also apply to the leadership at the very top.
Absolutely. I agree. So we've been going over a little bit of things that are concerning with this administration and just other concerning matters with people throughout and at the highest echelons of government. But what was the final piece that made you say, I'm done, I'm leaving federal service?
The final piece was not being able to get the exception to policy to put the program on in Ukraine. In fact, I turned down the Elon Musk buyout deal. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay and do that program for Ukraine. Of course, I didn't get the exception to policy. And the week I was supposed to be there is the day that J.D. Vance and Trump ganged up on Zelenskyy in the Oval Office. And to hear Kremlin talking points be parroted by our president to the champion of liberty and freedom in the world right now, the person fighting the fight at the very front lines, the person who said, I don't want a ride, I want more weapons to defend myself. I saw that as the U.S. turning its back on American leadership and the concept of America having a role to play as the good guy in the world. So I just didn't want to be affiliated with the direction we were heading. So I came back to where I'm from that month in March. Wasn't really sure what I would do. I accelerated a part-time MBA program that I was pursuing at the time and was able to finish that. But the very next month after arriving back here, my senior senator made an announcement that he wasn't seeking re-election, Dick Durbin. And then my congressman, Raja Krishnamurthy, made an announcement that he would seek that seat. And I started taking a look at the race. The president was pursuing an authoritarian agenda, either by weaponizing the law or acting outside of the law with impunity. I thought it was important to have someone with experience practicing law. And as we've seen, the president views the military as not only an instrument to express his imperial aspirations, but also go against our closest allies, threatening NATO, also threatening the American people through the Insurrection Act. And as we've already seen him being willing to use the military, as we saw him deploy active duty Marines to the streets of Los Angeles, and would have certainly done more if he had been allowed. The thing that really concerns me about this president's tendencies, especially driving towards the Insurrection Act, is that he doesn't want judicial review to restrain him. We saw him run up against judicial review in California when the courts told him that what he was doing was illegal. We saw him also run into restraint here in Chicagoland, where there were National Guard troops deployed to a suburb called Joliet, waiting to come into Chicago, but the court stopped him. The difference, though, with the Insurrection Act, as he's been trying to lay the groundwork for, it wouldn't be subject to judicial review. He would be able to order troops to come in, and there would be no recourse, as Congress, in its wisdom, did not provide a check on that apex of executive power. So one of the things I've been pushing for on the campaign trail is to reevaluate and put conditions on the presidential authority under the Insurrection Act, and to place limitations there, at least a review and consent period for Congress after X number of days.
So speaking about your campaign, you've got a lot of great points. You've been in government service. You've got a background working with politicians as well. What are your biggest points that you want to work for?
Absolutely. Across the country right now, affordability is the buzzword. Affordability, whether it's housing, whether it's utilities, groceries, childcare. The cost of living for Americans has exceeded their ability to afford the American dream. And I certainly have policy proposals for each one of those topics. And yet all of those proposals, the whole concept of congressional action, presupposes having a government that actually functions, presupposes a commitment to the rule of law and institutions that uphold our democracy. And so while I recognize the urgent need to bring down the cost of living for Americans across those different sectors of the economy, I would diagnose that the first problem that needs to be addressed is the structure of our government that is enabling an executive to pursue aggregation of power pursuant to the unitary executive theory that Trump seems to be enamored with, which says that the president should have more power than the other branches. We had founders who believed that the loyalties of the Congress would be to the institution. But we've seen that assumption play out in an unfavorable way, with the party in charge, or the party in the majority of Congress, being more loyal to their own political party, and even not so much the party, but more the personality in charge of the party rather than the institution. All that to say, I think the first thing that needs to be done is we need to address the illegal activity that's been going on, and also shift conditions within our government to prevent it from happening again. And my proposal is my Trump accountability plan. There are 10 different steps throughout the plan, and there's 3 different buckets. One bucket is a couple different ways we can reassert congressional authority and reassert congressional power when it comes to key areas. Number 2 is to limit executive power in several key ways. And then third is to reshape and reform judicial power. I'd say the major highlights are using the congressional subpoena power to demand that DHS provide all employment records, all trip logs, vehicle expenses, all documentation that memorializes any ICE agent trip within this last year, such that the U.S. Congress can figure out who was behind the mask in each ICE abuse incident that we've seen across the country. If the FBI can figure out who was among the crowd of thousands of people that stormed the Capitol behind masks on January 6th, certainly the U.S. Congress can have a commission to figure out which federal employee was behind the mask in each ICE abuse incident. And then we can hold them accountable, not only politically, but also be prepared to hold them accountable criminally. I say politically because one of my points in this plan is to say in the Constitution, there is language that's often overlooked. It talks about how all civil officers of the United States are eligible for impeachment. And I'm going to make the argument that ICE agents are civil officers of the executive branch. And as such, they are eligible for impeachment. Sure, there's not a lot of precedent for impeaching below the cabinet level. At the same time, we live in an era of unprecedented executive power. Shouldn't we expect the Congress to use unprecedented constitutional power? At the same time, we would be having this commission prepare cases that could be sent to a restored DOJ. For instance, if the Democrats retake the executive branch in 28, 29, we could restore the independence of the DOJ and then send those cases pre-ready to go to that independent DOJ to decide whether or not to proceed.
Everybody talks about, oh, well, if this is constitutional or if this is not constitutional. And I think a lot of people haven't taken the time to go back and actually look at the Constitution and reread.
If even our lawmakers right now were to reread the Constitution, they would see in pretty clear terms they have far more responsibilities and they have far more power that's specifically attributed and given to them by the Constitution than they're currently wielding. Of course, I'm thinking about tariffs and war powers. Tariffs being explicitly laid out in the enumerated powers as the ability to regulate trade between nations. And that's given to Congress. And yet, over the course of several administrations, we've seen Congress be silent on tariffs and let the president take leadership there. What I think Congress should do is reassert its power in legislation, a requirement that the executive, before enacting any new tariffs, has to go through a congressional review and consent period, where either going through both chambers or one chamber, there has to be a stop or a pause in the system in Congress before any new tariffs can be in place. If we were to bring down tariffs, we would see not only a reduction in the housing market in terms of cost, but also in terms of food. 20% of food that Americans eat comes from overseas. And those tariffs that are on food, they're not placed on the people sending the food to the United States. They're placed on the people importing the food. And of course, that tax is passed down to the consumer. The other thing I would flag is war powers. Congress has the exclusive responsibility and exclusive power to declare war under the Constitution. And yet we've seen, of course, across administrations, Congress largely ceding that power. We haven't declared a war since World War II. And yet our military has been involved across the world in various conflicts. And Congress has allowed that to happen either through authorizations for the use of military force, and then other times Congress has just let presidents wield the military under a purely executive authority. Now we've gotten to a point under this president where that has been accelerated. We saw the president of the United States use our most elite special forces units to take out the leader of a foreign country. And he didn't tell the Congress, not even the Gang of Eight, before he used the military in that way. However, he did tell the oil executives of the companies that he was going in to liberate the oil for. So all that to say, we need Congress to reassert its role in war powers, specifically in the war declaration process. Now, what does war declaration mean in the context of modern warfare? I think that's open to debate, but what I think it should mean, there's a general principle that the president should not be able to initiate new kinetic action against a foreign target without some role of consulting Congress and getting consent from Congress. And in the Trump Accountability Plan, I have a specific tool to do that. If you look at the NDAA, Congress could in place a two-part language. One, saying that any expenditure of funds has to be made pursuant to either a war declared by Congress or to an operation authorized by Congress. The second step is to spread liability throughout the political appointees of the DoD, similar to the Anti-Deficiency Act, where political appointees can be held personally and criminally responsible for expenditure of funds in excess of the funds they've been appropriated. This construct would spread liability throughout the political appointees to say, if they authorize, if they approve expenditures of funds for something other than operations authorized by Congress or wars declared by Congress, they can be held personally and criminally responsible for those funds. I think it would just be a forcing function to get the executive to see Congress as a relevant power player in this dynamic.
That would allow us as individual citizens to see, did my congressperson approve this or not? Depending on how it's represented in somebody's district back home, that may actually impact how they're voting on whether or not we should get into these new conflicts. And I think that's what a lot of Americans have wanted for the past 20 years now, is more of a say in, are we going to be involved in this specific conflict or operation?
I completely agree.
Yeah. So I want to pivot to elections because you're going through an electoral process right now. There's voting coming up at the beginning of March. Is that right?
That's right. We're even in early voting right now. We've got only 33 days left to go.
All right. With that, and talking about voting and having people get out and vote, there's been a lot of talk from this administration about federalizing elections. What are your thoughts on this?
I'm deeply concerned by this president's interest in nationalizing elections. The Constitution gives the power to run elections to the states, and whether it's run at the state level or the county level, the system preserves the integrity of our elections, especially when it comes to electing a president. We saw firsthand in 2020 the power of the state-run process when the president of the United States called Georgia and called a state officer to say that he wanted 11,000 more votes. Now, if the president had a nationalized election system, he wouldn't have had to make that call. He could have ordered a recount or a change to find those votes or to remove other votes that would have given him much more control. Right now, we have a system in which the power of running elections is dispersed and states can make their own rules. And that's greatly under threat. As we've seen about 2 weeks ago from this point of taping, the FBI go and raid a local election office to pull what are now historic ballots from 2020 to do a recount. While that's concerning in and of itself, I'm more concerned of what that means as a test run for a future federal raid on a state or local election office. Specifically, what's to stop now Pam Bondi from going in the night after an election or the day after and saying, we can't trust you to count your ballots, state. The federal government is here to help and do that. To see that this president has even said that there are 15 states that he can't trust to count their own ballots, that signals that there's interest in getting more and more federal involvement. We were talking a little bit before about how the president and his helpers are envisioning using ICE at the polls, trying to either intimidate people from voting or to have express some other nefarious purpose. I think that there's steps that Congress can do right now to protect our election integrity. And the number one thing is look at the actual legal mechanisms behind the warranting process. The FBI raid on Fulton County relied on a search warrant issued by a magistrate judge, which is the lowest level of adjudicator in the federal court system. I think such a high level and high stakes warrant that could have a huge impact on our elections and our democracy, that should be only available at a higher level of scrutiny. So the policy platform that I've put forward includes elevating that search warrant approval for state and local election offices to an appellate court level, requiring also en banc proceedings. So that would basically elevate the review to the second from the top level of review, bringing in much more highly vetted jurists such that would better reflect the gravity of what's at stake. And of course, for when it actually comes to having ICE agents at the polls, one of the things I've been talking about on the campaign trail is puncturing sovereign immunity and qualified immunity, basically making the agents responsible personally for their illegal acts. Now, those immunity doctrines are designed to protect the good faith efforts of law enforcement to exercise the duties of their jobs. But when we're talking about ICE agents at poll places intimidating voters, that's clearly outside the scope of any legal use of ICE. And any agent that decides to participate, even if they are ordered to do so, if they decide to participate and to break the law, they should be able to be held accountable in state court, both criminally and civilly, depending on the type of crime that they're committing. And Congress could do that right now by puncturing both those doctrines.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
To say we're going to send ICE agents, first of all, under what power are you sending an immigration officer? Nothing makes sense anymore. Sorry, nothing makes sense anymore. Yeah.
Completely agree. It's, I think, a clear sign that this president is interested in shaping the midterms. And I think the major red flag to watch out for as we approach November is the Insurrection Act. If the president decides to use the military against the American people in a way that is not subject to judicial review, that is a clear indication that he's interested in intervening. As he himself has said, if he loses the midterms, if the Republicans do, he will most likely be impeached. That's the greatest danger that he's worried about. It's all about his own personal political standing. But all that to say, when we are talking about ICE agents possibly acting outside the law when it comes to elections, one of the other tools that I think Congress should use is inherent contempt. This is a tool, a constitutional tool that's been available on the books that hasn't really been used since the 1920s, and yet it could compel out-of-check, lawless actors in the federal government to stop what they're doing. So, for instance, Kristi Noem. If Kristi Noem is directing ICE agents or even allowing ICE agents to be used in ways at polling locations, the Congress could issue a citation of inherent contempt against Kristi Noem. Now, she would either have to show up herself to the House floor, or the sergeant at arms would go and get her and arrest her and bring her to the House floor. She'd be read the charges against her. She'd have an opportunity to respond. And then the Congress could either vote to impose fines personally on her or even incarcerate her up until the end of the term of Congress. So, 2 years maximum. When I talk about this idea, people say, this sounds preposterous. The sergeant at arms, this mostly ceremonial position, going to arrest the Department of Homeland Security secretary. You've never seen that. Well, we've never seen executive power being exercised beyond its apex right now in unlawful ways. Shouldn't we have the Congress at least use all constitutional tools available to act as a check on executive power? And folks say, what's the difference between statutory contempt and this inherent contempt idea? Well, statutory contempt, that's that criminal process that's threatened against folks that refuse to testify before Congress, the Clintons, for example. That is a creature of statute, which means it's under the president's purview to pardon. So if someone were hit with a citation of criminal contempt, the president could wipe that clean. And yet inherent contempt is different, as it doesn't arise from statute. It is a creature that arises from the investigatory function of Congress itself. And so if Congress were to hit Kristi Noem with a citation of inherent contempt, they could either fine or incarcerate her, with the purpose, of course, being to either stop her from continuing her program, or, if she doesn't want to change her mind, take her out of the picture by keeping her under congressional control. That's a tool available if the Democrats retake the House, and something I would certainly pursue if I'm there.
That is, I think, a very important thing for people to know about, because, as you said, we've never seen it happen because it's never been necessary to even consider. And I think that sort of goes to the larger problem. There are a lot of authorities that have existed for the past 250 years that we haven't had to really tap into because everybody has been operating more or less with noble intent. Now, a large portion of the people in power don't think it's necessary to account for their behavior.
And so many of these things underscore the importance of having a politically independent DOJ. Right now, we have a DOJ that functions as a puppet of the administration. If the president wants to investigate his political rivals like James Comey, he tells the AG and she'll do it. Or if he wants the DOJ to overlook corruption, for instance, Tom Homan accepting a $50,000 bribe in a fast food bag, nothing to see there, and the DOJ will not investigate. Yet we've seen presidents before this president observe the norm of political independence of the DOJ, and this president has trampled that norm. So what does Congress need to do? I think that Congress needs to not only restore political independence of the DOJ by putting in protections that protect it from political influence, I think Congress needs to go further. My proposal calls for converting the position of AG from being appointed by the president to being elected by the people during the midterms. Now, if you think about how that would work, right now, as we're approaching the midterms, we'd have an opportunity to elect an attorney general to serve as a check on executive power from within the executive branch. Folks often raise the concern, there's executive power. How do you have two different actors be elected separately? Well, 43 states currently have that model where both a governor and an attorney general are elected. There's still only one executive branch, and somehow they're able to make it work. I would think that this is even a proposal that Republicans would get behind. Back in 2022, Biden wasn't too popular. I would imagine that Republicans would have liked to have a chance 2 years after a presidential election to vote for an attorney general to serve as a check on the president. Now, we're not making the attorney general insulated from politics, but rather we're making the influence over the attorney general be the American people rather than the president who was elected 2 years ago. And then, of course, 2 years after the attorney general is elected, the president would be up and so forth. Now, we can talk about specific concerns that would arise, but I think overall, having a check on executive power from within the executive branch is essential when we can't rely on Congress to act as a check on executive power.
Yeah, that really makes you think. I mean, to take us back, even though you have left public service, you're campaigning to get back into this public service, to still serve the American people. But would you ever go back to a job like you had before with commerce, or what would it take for you to go back?
Oh, certainly. I think the job that I was doing was an ideal job. I got to help foreign countries improve the rule of law, countering China, while also traveling to places I never would have otherwise gotten to go see. I loved my job. And yet, under the current administration, I can't envision trusting that administration to be affiliated with its intentions. I fully hope to go back to government service in some capacity. We all, in this moment of time of transition during this administration, hopefully it's a historical anomaly. Some of us see our ways of serving by staying in our jobs and continuing to do the work despite all the chaos at the top. Others have decided to leave and highlight other folks who used to be federal civil servants through a podcast and brings attention to stories of the incredible work that folks are doing right now all across the country. And then there's others who decide that what they can make a difference in is the political arena, make a difference from that approach. Whatever the approach is, I think that those of us who have been civil servants have a responsibility and a deeper understanding of what's at stake than most Americans. And so however we see our way to help, we should certainly do that. I would just add a last note for any listeners who are interested in pursuing the political route. I'm happy to talk. My election is going to be on March 17th. So win or lose, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm able to be found publicly. Please reach out. I'm happy to talk about what I learned. I never ran for office before. Within the last 9 months, it has been a learning experience each and every day.
Are there any resources online or otherwise that you would refer people to if they want to learn more about how to register to vote or where they should go to vote or the correct voting mechanisms?
Absolutely. So if you look at your county clerk's website, everybody has a different county, but I assume that everybody knows their own county. Just search your county name plus clerk's office. There's going to be an election division. And in the election division website, there'll be links about how to register. Registration has never been easier. Unfortunately, it could be getting harder under this new administration's SAVE Act. And also the actual act of voting could get harder as well. But right now, as of the date of taping, it's relatively an easy process to do. I just search your county clerk's office, and it'll be easy to find that information.
So before we sign off, Dan, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I just want to express my thanks to you both for having me on today, as well as to the listeners. I think that in this time of crisis for the country, we all are finding a way forward, and sometimes it's straightforward, sometimes it's winding. I simply think that if we all, those of us who have served in government in some capacity and want to see our government succeed because we believe in the purpose of public service, if we all persevere in whatever way that we can during these next several years, we can get back to a place where we have a government that reflects the will and the interests of the people. There's going to be a lot of destruction. There already has been the past year, and there certainly will be more over the next 3. But it will take those of us who knew the government before this second Trump administration to rebuild it and to reshape it to work for the American people again. So I'm excited to be part of that work. I don't know exactly in what capacity I'll do it, but I hope to see more and more other federal civil servants returning to the government at some point.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dan. We wish you all the best, especially on March 17th. And we will be following that to see. We'll have Dan's website, his LinkedIn, all of those on our webpage and in our show notes. But Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for forking off with us.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was really fun, right, Philip? Like, that was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah. He has some really good ideas, and whether he wins or loses, I hope that people take that stuff very seriously.
Exactly.
I would love to see somebody use inherent contempt against Kristi Noem. And why not throw Pam Bondi in there while we're at it?
Yeah.
Maybe Cash. Actually, my list is kind of long. Greg Bavino.
Yeah. You're Tom Homan. Yeah, the list is long.
I'm sorry, did you say Kingpin?
I mean, he does kind of have that
He's got
look.
strong Kingpin vibes.
He really does. He really, really does. But, Dan made some really great points about separation of powers. Now, I'm not going to nerd out and talk to you about like the 3 rings of government. If anyone's listened to Schoolhouse Rock, I'll put a link in the notes for it. But he did make some really great points about Congress has these powers that they really need to start using because otherwise the executive is trying to take those powers. Now, since we talked to Dan, the Supreme Court came out with a decision that was quite surprising to everyone. This last Friday, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 against President Trump's use of tariffs under IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. And they straight up said the president does not have the power to impose tariffs on imports from any country of any product at any rate for any amount of time, especially under IEEPA. Surprisingly, I'm going to mention Justice Gorsuch and his concurring opinion. He laid out a very simple explanation in his concurrence as to why he and the other conservative justices voted this way. He explained that the legislative process is extremely important because it is a contemplative process, and that results in laws that last longer because they have been debated, they have been contemplated, and it helps with stabilizing the economy because people can actually plan based on that. Now, President Trump responded typical fashion, criticizing the court, calling them fools and lapdogs, and even stated that he had been such a good boy so far, which, oh my gosh, what times are we living in? And even stated that he has the power to destroy the country and he can destroy trade. He's attempting to reimpose those same tariffs, but using different trade acts. First, he said it was going to be 10%. On Saturday, he changed it to 15%. The executive order he signed is supposed to go into effect on Tuesday. We'll see. That's the day that this episode comes out. But it will be interesting to see how Congress is going to respond to the Supreme Court's most recent ruling and how the Supreme Court is going to respond to Trump trying to use other trade acts to enforce new tariffs.
Those are some really great points, especially about the legislative process being a contemplative process. Like that's really important right now with sort of the way that the president has been attempting to legislate. It sort of brings to mind some of the other issues that Dan talked about how Congress could legislate and the states could also legislate to introduce more checks. And one of the big points that Dan talked about was piercing the veil of sovereign immunity.
Yeah.
And there's an effort here in California to bring some accountability in with the No Secret Police Act. That's California's law to ban federal law enforcement from wearing masks when they're doing these operations. That's really important from the perspective of state and local governments being able to enforce laws over the federal government. And this is something that I've heard a lot from my old colleagues at LAPD LAPD, as well as like even the chief of police on TV saying LAPD can't enforce laws against the federal government. That's just ridiculous. They do this all the time. They do it in as simple acts as giving an FBI agent a speeding ticket when he's driving his Buick car during work hours. That's a very simple example, but we can also go back. A lot of people don't realize that before 1934, the FBI didn't have arrest powers. They weren't authorized by a federal law to carry firearms. They relied on the Second Amendment, or they got concealed carry permits from the states. And to make arrests, they either had to be deputized by a state or local authority, or they had to use citizens' arrest powers.
Oh, that's fun.
So it's really interesting because in those situations, they were being governed by the states. And there's even an example from the 20s of where the New York special agent in charge had directed his agents to get concealed carry permits from the state of New York to be able to carry firearms on duty. That's a perfect example of how the states were regulating how the FBI could do its job within their borders. And it's really important context, too, for this thing going around with all of the states. There's this draft legislation they're urging states to consider called the Universal Constitutional Remedies Act. The general premise here is to allow federal law enforcement to be sued in state court. And this has a lot of people questioning, oh, they can't do that. And then there's this other piece of legislation. It's federal legislation. It's called the Bivens Act, and it would add U.S. officials to the list of people who can be sued in federal court under 42 U.S.C. 1983, which is essentially deprivation of constitutional rights. And a lot of people think that wasn't the intent of the Constitution, but it absolutely was. There's this paper of sovereignty and federalism. It's this 1987 Yale law paper. It essentially argued that this is how the supremacy clause was litigated for the first 200 years of our democracy. In it, the author, he cites, in the Federalist Papers, he cites Madison, who said, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other. At the same time, each will control itself. This is like states policing feds and the feds policing the states. Like that was a normal, expected thing. And then Hamilton said, if the rights are invaded by either, they can make use of the other as the instrument of redress. And so he's saying there are redress mechanisms between the state and federal governments. Like there are checks there as well. And this is really important to understand the idea behind sovereign immunity because the Supremacy Clause states federal laws made in pursuance of the Constitution are the law of the land, right? But there's a really important phrase there, made in pursuance of the Constitution. And the argument is that unconstitutional acts are by definition not taken in pursuit of the Constitution. And so under the Bivens Act, you're not protected for unconstitutional acts, because you're not working in pursuit of the Constitution. It's the same idea with the state legislations. And I think that this could actually be a really good tool to use to protect the midterms coming up, because Congress could actually tie passage of the Bivens Act to DHS's funding right now. That hasn't gone through yet. They could say, if you want your money, you've got to pass the Bivens Act, and then DHS officials could be sued if they violate people's constitutional rights at the polls. And that's a good deterrent. People can also encourage their state legislatures to implement some version of the Universal Constitutional Remedies Act. I would also say that people could encourage their police departments to exercise their duty to intervene when they're out at these events and they see federal law enforcement violating constitutional rights. They have a duty to do that. Every law enforcement officer, it doesn't matter, state, local, federal, they all have that duty.
Absolutely. That's going to be something to watch and something to see how all of this is going to play out. So, what can we do?
In reference to the things that we were just talking about, if you think that Congress should pass the Bivens Act, use the 5 Calls app, call them right now, tell them. It'll help you find your representatives and your senators and draft messages that you can send to all of them. And you can let them all know, I think that you need to pass this legislation now. I think that you need to pass it as a stipulation of DHS's funding.
Yeah, absolutely. 5calls.org. We'll have the link.
Make sure that you're registered to vote. Make sure that your registration is valid and active.
There's been a big push by the Republican Party to go through and cull the rolls, the voter rolls. for people that have been active, that haven't voted in 1 or 2 elections. So if you haven't voted, definitely double check your registration. I know in California, you can do it when you get your driver's license. If you don't have a driver's license, check your county clerk's page and see where you can register.
There is this thing called the SAVE Act that they're hoping to push through that would make registering to vote more complicated.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Now would be a really good time to start making sure that you know where your birth certificate is and that you have copies of those types of documents that might be required under the SAVE Act.
Yeah, it's all the same things that you would need for a real ID.
Yeah, not everybody is going to have a real ID because not everybody drives or flies or needs one.
Exactly. Exactly. All right, 5 calls out. Make sure you check your registration for voting and then get out there and vote. All right, until next time.
Thanks for forking off with us. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Forking Off.
If you're a former Fed with a story to tell, or you're wrestling with your own ethical crossroads, reach out to us at info@forkingoff.com.
Today's episode was created, produced, and edited by Jill and Philip Fields. You can find more information about this episode at forkingoff.com. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, or wherever you get your podcasts.